Hello friends. Operational situation at the front on the 30th of January. We will also analyze the news background at the end, but we will start with the Skopinski-Limenski direction. This means that active hostilities continue in our area of Avdeevka, in the area of Starch, respectively, in neighboring areas. The enemy is also probing the direction of Berestev, the defense of the armed forces of Ukraine. There are a number of statements both from our side and from the enemy about what is happening here. From our side, it is reported that it was possible to dislodge Russian troops from Avdeevka. We have been adding a part of the gray zone. Well, on the contrary, there are statements from the enemy that they are now attacking in the direction of Sandy from Avdeevka. So in fact, there is a rather dynamic situation, I will say, and active hostilities are taking place on this sector of the front. That's why I say the situation is dynamic. There are attacks in the direction of Sandy, there are attacks in Avdeevka itself, that is in its western part. Attempts to move beyond the river, as well as along the pike beam to move in its western direction, are being made by Russian troops. And at the same time, there are attacks in the northern direction, from the Tobayevsky-Stavka area, in the direction of Kotlyarovka, but they now have some positional character. But in general, if we speak for this site, the situation is dynamic. It's too early to talk about anything. But I think that in about 24 hours, the situation will become more or less clear, because a lot of stuffing, of course, will go on this site. And from what we have, we do not fix any significant changes. This is in short. On the Limansky direction, on the Seversky without significant changes. In the Bakhmut direction, Bogdanovka. So, in Bogdanovka itself, the red zone was reduced, and the gray zone was reduced, based on the new shots that were published. We have already reduced the gray zone in Bogdanovka itself, and the red one, because first of all, there were statements from the Russian side that they retreated to the northeastern part, not they were able to gain a foothold. Secondly, this is about the message that Russian troops occupied about 40% of the settlement, from a fighter of the 93rd Brigade. And accordingly, there were personnel, we were reduced. To date, fresh footage of the software has been published. The enemy has published strikes on the positions of the IFU. And here, in fact, we see that there is also a rollback of the red zone. The situation for yesterday, the situation for today looks like this plus or minus. Naturally, the enemy is making attempts to improve tactical positions, increasing the number of artillery strikes on this sector of the front. This should also be noted. We'll talk about this later, which actually increases the pressure on Bogdanovka herself. As for Ivanovsky and Kleshivka, this section of the front continues, I would say, of a positional nature, more fighting. Although there are a number of statements directly from the fighters that Russian troops are now taking very active offensive actions here. But again, because of the proximity of the positions of the Garden Association and Ivanovsky, of course, the partial success of the enemy, is the entrance to the settlement. There is no such thing, so it is possible to restrain on the positional tactics of the Russian troops, that is, not allowing them to pass further, and accordingly, not using maneuverable defense. Therefore, we do not record any changes today in this sector of the front. There is also some activity of the eastern Avdeevka, but again it has a positional character. Gorlovko. It means that footage was published, footage of the storming of one of the positions. I posted a video in my Telegram this morning. So, the defense forces knocked out from one of the positions of the Russian troops 225th Brigade, Battalion, or rather 225th TRO. Look at the situation. This position has been under the control of the enemy since 2000 of the 14th year. Initially, the DPI, the LPR in the formation, and then the Russian troops. It was possible, accordingly, to knock them out. You can watch the full footage of the assault in my Telegram, or from Alexander Sirsky he published. It means that they knocked out and added a gray zone, because today there is no information that you have already gained a foothold. They retreated from this position, but in any case, the Russian troops were knocked out, a strong enough position. Naturally, the armed forces of Ukraine also use tactics that are used by Russian troops, namely, scattering strikes to a neighboring section of the front in order to stretch their forces due to the fact that now, as you can see, Russian troops are concentrating the main attack from the south in the Avdeevka direction. Since in the north for the most part we are already seeing absolute in the north on the flank, I mean, absolute positionality. In other words, there are no large-scale attacks that were before, they have all shifted to the south. Well, we turn to the Avdeevka direction. The northern flank, of course, we state the situation without any changes. The main fighting, if we are talking about the northern flank, is now an attempt by Russian troops to descend from Vesely and gain a foothold along one of the forest belts. There are several strong points along the forest belt in the area, including T-shaped intersections. Attempts are being made to gain a foothold in this area. For the most part, they use infantry. If they attacked with armored vehicles before, now there is a big bet on small infantry groups again. On the southern flank, we are recording the further advance of the enemy. Let's start right from the section of the northern industrial zone. We have already added a red zone yesterday, as you remember, based on geolinking of drone frames that were. And we said that we stormed one of the positions north of the support. But the support has clearly moved into the red zone, and updated information has already been received, which means that the enemy managed to advance further, for about a small distance, about 110 meters deep, in a section up to 430 wide, but still he advanced. And here the main message is not so much promotion, as taking a strong point. Therefore, the situation today looks like this. We have said that there will be an attempt, most likely, to bypass the Donetsk filtration station, because there were attempts from the Russian side to attack it head-on, to storm it. Managed to repel all attacks. But as for the forest area, the planting itself, this is exactly the same territory where very heavy battles can potentially ensue. This is also a bet on the Russian side, because if we take the example of the Serebryansky forest near Kremenaya, large forces are concentrated there, both the enemy and ours, but we do not record significant changes, despite the fact that there are daily fighting active assault actions both from the enemy and from the IFU, the defense forces. But significant changes are extremely difficult to achieve. And just the same, one of the enemy's goals now is this tactic, which is in the Serebryansky forest, that is, to stretch our forces as much as possible, to pull combat-ready brigades to this section of the front, which is potentially important because, well, first of all, we understand that this is a call, maybe in Avdeevka itself. Secondly, that this is an environment, in any case, a semicircle of Donetsk and the filtration station, which is also a part of the district. Therefore, the tactics of the enemy in this sector of the front are extremely clear, south of Avdeevka. There are also a few points to comment on here. The first is the royal hunt. To date, in fact, the fighters themselves from the field report that the Tsurs hunting complex is under the control of Russian troops. What I told you yesterday. Therefore, there is such a moment, but the enemy from the royal hunt has also moved east along the road. There again, as with the area under the Donetsk filtration station, we are talking not so much for the advance as the strong point was taken. As for the south of Avdeevka itself, here we record the further advance of Russian troops, in a section up to 410 meters wide. These are Sobornaya Street, Sportivnaya Street, Chernyshevskaya Street, to a depth of 280 meters in the western direction. Well as the plot in the landing itself, in the direction, conditionally, of the railway, let's say, of the country village. The situation for yesterday, the situation for today. There are a number of reports that Russian troops are shifting the strike in this sector of the front as well. They are not shifting the blow to the Dacha village, it is there by itself, and we talked about it, that potentially they will try to take it. Because they will not storm the fortified areas of Cheburashka and Zenit, they will try to strike from two directions. This is exactly the same attempt to take a Dacha village and move from the experimental one, initially in the north direction, to the T-shaped intersection, and then move in the east direction. This is what the Russian troops are planning, including transferring additional forces to this section of the front. In other words, this suggests that they are aiming to level the front line, and of course, to stabilize their flanking position in this area. And at the same time, there is another shift, for which I wanted to say, this shift in the direction of garages and set of lane. It also means that there are reports that Russian troops are making attempts not only in the western, but also in the northeastern direction, to advance in this sector of the front. We said there would definitely be an attempt. There were probes, that is, to close a section of the gray zone, in which there are also active hostilities. And accordingly, to expand, of course, to go along Avdeevka itself, with a wider front. That is, to expand as much as possible the zone of active hostilities directly in the city itself, in its southern part. The situation remains difficult, the fighting continues fierce. Very fierce in the south of Avdeevka. We move to the western flank and Pervomeyskaya. On the western flank, we still have positional fighting. In addition to the experimental site, there is some concentration here. The enemy is now probing the defense of the Ifu, of course, conducts some stabilization measures under the experienced. Well, and most likely it will try to strike, as we said, initially in a northerly direction. This is on the western flank. On Pervomeysky, fighting continues along Voroshilev Street and at Izmailovsky Stavka. We do not record any new changes, but the enemy is not going to abandon plans for this sector of the front, and also continues assault operations. The activity is quite high. Now, as for the Kurikovsky and South Donetsk directions. Here I will comment a little more in detail, and this is exactly what I said about Bogdanovka, the number of artillery strikes. So, it is reported directly from the field that now, if before we observed a picture when the enemy intensified tactical air strikes, that is air bombs and periodically missile airstrikes, then today I state that the barrel and rocket artillery of the Russian troops is working hard. This indicates that artillery preparation is underway in this area. Such settlements as Novomikhailivka, Pobeda, Georgievka, Maximilianovka were announced. In particular, the enemy is using very much now in this area. This suggests that in the near future, it will carry out assault operations, and most likely these are the main directions. This still remains the eastern part of Georgievka, an attempt to circumvent the victory. Not to storm the victory itself, but to bypass it. I will tell you more about this now. And Novomikhailivka will advance, in the north of Novomikhailivka near the fortifications of the district. I will comment on the victory. It means that satellite images of changes for January, the beginning and the end of January, were published. The number of artillery strikes, where which zones have changed. And one of the zones is exactly what we talked about, a T-shaped intersection. It is very much under the blows of enemy artillery now. That is, what can be seen from the changes. And another part of the forest belt, that is the enemy, as we have said with you, the vector of his attacks, Smorinka, will not be so much victory, namely the territory of the field-abandoned reservoir, and it is aimed at it. That is, then try to advance along the forest belt in a westerly direction, and attack with a wider coverage. But at the same time, you need to remember what I said, that the enemy does not have a goal to go fast right now, because he is really already betting huge on the green, that is for the spring, April, May month, in order to strike with larger forces. In other words, this is his main idea. Now move a little bit, as far as possible, but the main blows. Thanks to Zelenka, of course, they will try to reduce the influence factor of the FV drones, kamikaze drones, and strike with larger forces. That is, it is clear here. That is, the enemy is trying to implement it. I will comment on the Veliko-Novoselkovsky direction here again. Shelter, we commented on the evening broadcast yesterday. We added a gray zone, as you remember. So they were analyzing the geolinking of frames from drones. And yesterday we devoted not only to the evening broadcast, but also to the daytime one. During the day, we added a gray zone near the forest plantation, approximately in this area. In the evening, a gray zone was added in this area. There was geolinking, which means that a Russian column was stopped at the T-shaped intersection, as you remember. It was mostly broken, however. However, the enemy managed to gain a foothold in a number of areas, and the attacks were in two directions. The situation for yesterday, the situation for today. Here, the enemy managed to advance up to 2 and 1 kilometers on the front line. Well, plus some refinements were added, and to a depth of up to 500 meters, the progress was. Active hostilities continue. The situation is being further clarified, because there are active hostilities. As you know, the situation is dynamic. Actually, the enemy continues to put pressure on this site. This is what we talked about in terms of reserves. It must be remembered that you can't wind yourself up, that the enemy will run out of them tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, in a year. It is necessary to prepare, as they say, for the worst always, and it is better to overestimate than underestimate, as we have already had, because the enemy, as you can see, is ready to attack everywhere. It doesn't matter if we succeed or not, the main thing is to disperse our forces. Well, from the side of the high, we see that this tactic is also used, as far as possible. The Gorlovka direction is also being probed, west of Gorlovka, where Russian troops were knocked out from one of the strongholds of the fortified area. There was an abandoned gas station there. It was a fairly strong fortified area. But this is one moment. Naturally, the enemy will now make efforts to strengthen its defensive position in the area between Gorlovka and New York, realizing potentially that there is not the best zone for them, as it turns out. In general, as it turned out, they do not have such strong positions in Gorlovka, if we take November, December and January. Everything that happened, the waste heaps, some moments. It is clear that the enemy through additional forces stabilized the situation, but initially his defense there was not as effective as expected. There is such a moment, and I will comment on the last one on the front. This is for the markets. So, the enemy is telling us two pieces of news. Firstly, that he is making further attempts to knock the APU out of the market, while already betting not so much on assault actions, as on saturating this section of the front with sufficiently experienced WAV operators, well, and the number of WAVs. At the same time, the second news is that the enemy complains that there are a lot of drones with night vision in this sector of the front. That is, the night became unsafe for the enemy. As you remember, initially the Russian troops published several frames about 2 months ago of F drones with night vision, which made the night a potentially dangerous period of time because they see perfectly and are ready to attack even small assault groups, attack any equipment, and so on, and so on. This needs to be understood. But here, the initiative very quickly began to move to the APU, which is very, very good. Naturally, we need to work in this direction, work very seriously, carry out a lot of work, both on production and on procurement. But this is one moment, yes, because there is actually a huge section of the front, and it should be added that the fighters themselves complain from our side. Yes, they are not only fighters. You probably saw the news. It was also published by Telegram channels, news resources. It means that the Russian DRG has become more active in the border area of Chernihiv, Sumy region. Not so much Kharkiv as Sumy, Chernihiv. What is the reason for this? This is naturally due to the fact that our forces and operators of WAVs and F drones are scattered. That is, so that they do not concentrate locally on some areas, but also as much as possible along the entire front line. Even where there are no active hostilities, it is bordered so that they are used there. And unfortunately, we have to react to this as well. Therefore, there is still a lot of work in the development plan in Padrins. This is the situation we have today, on the 30th